The human mind is capable of horrors beyond imagination, acts so depraved, so grotesque, that they seem impossible to comprehend. We tell ourselves that monsters don't exist, that the stories we hear are just that, stories. But in the small, isolated town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a real monster was lurking, a man whose crimes would shock the world, whose name would become legend in the darkest corners of history. His name was Ed Gein. To understand the nightmare that Ed Gein became, we must go back to where it all began, to a childhood filled with isolation, cruelty, and a mother whose influence would shape him into one of the most infamous figures in American crime history. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. From the very beginning, his life was anything but normal. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gein, a deeply dysfunctional couple who would shape his future in unimaginable ways. His father, George Gein, was a weak man, an alcoholic, a failure who bounced from job to job, never able to hold on to steady work. He drank himself into oblivion, his presence in the home nothing more than a shadow of failure and rage. And then, there was Augusta, a devoutly religious, fanatically controlling woman. Augusta despised her husband, viewing him as pathetic, weak, and useless. Divorce was a sin in her eyes, so instead, she made a decision, one that would define the fate of her two sons. She would isolate them from the sinful outside world. In 1915, when Ed was around 9 years old, Augusta moved the family to a remote 155-acre farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. It was miles from town, miles from neighbors, miles from anything that could influence her children. And that was exactly what she wanted. The farm was lifeless, empty, cold. Surrounded by dense woods and endless fields, it was a place where Augusta could control everything. Two rules governed the Gein household: no friends, no outside influences. Ed and his older brother Henry were forbidden from socializing with other children. They couldn't attend school functions. They couldn't visit neighbors. They couldn't speak to outsiders. Because according to Augusta, the world was wicked, sinful, corrupt. She filled their young minds with fear. Every night she read them fire and brimstone sermons from the Old Testament, warning them about the evils of lust, sin, and most of all, women. In Augusta's eyes, all women, except for herself, were whores, temptresses, instruments of the devil designed to corrupt men and lead them into damnation. And Ed, he believed every word. Ed was an odd child, shy, socially awkward, uncomfortable around others. At school, he was seen as strange. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his classmates found him peculiar. He would sometimes burst into laughter at random moments, as if hearing a joke no one else could. He was relentlessly bullied, mocked for his lazy eye, his odd behavior, and his complete lack of social skills. Despite the bullying, Ed excelled in reading and writing. But when he returned home from school, he had no friends, no escape, only Augusta. She was his entire world, his only teacher, his only companion. He worshipped her. But his brother Henry saw her for what she was, a manipulative, cruel woman who had poisoned their lives. And for that, Henry would not live much longer. On May 16, 1944, a brush fire broke out on the Gein property. Henry and Ed worked together to put it out. But when the flames were finally extinguished, Henry was gone. Hours later, authorities found his body lying face down in the dirt. There were no burns, no signs of fire-related injuries. But there was something else. Bruising on his head, as if he had been struck. Something didn't add up. Yet, no investigation was ever launched. His death was ruled accidental asphyxiation from the fire. And just like that, the case was closed. Ed never showed a single sign of sadness over his brother's death, because now, Augusta was his, and his alone. Later that year, Augusta suffered a stroke. Ed cared for her day and night, nursing her, tending to her every need. But in December of 1945, Augusta suffered a second stroke, and on December 29, 1945, she was gone. With her last breath, she took everything Ed had ever known, his only friend, his only connection to reality. Now, he was completely alone, and his mind would never be the same again. For the next 12 years, Ed Gein became a ghost. He abandoned the farm, letting it rot, swallowed by weeds and decay. The house, once ruled by Augusta's strict discipline, sank into filth and darkness. But one room remained untouched, Augusta's bedroom, preserved, sealed off from time. The bed neatly made, the furniture exactly as she had left it, a shrine to the woman who had dominated his existence. Outside that door, however, Ed was unraveling. His mind is consumed by death, his obsession with his mother festering into something unthinkable. During these years, Ed withdrew completely from society. He survived on small handyman jobs, occasionally helping locals with repairs or farm work. He would venture into town only when necessary, often trading goods rather than using money. People knew him as odd, but harmless. A strange man, dressed in old, tattered clothing, shuffling through the streets of Plainfield with his toothless grin and vacant stare. He spent his nights reading obsessively. His favorite books: pulp horror magazines, true crime stories, medical textbooks on anatomy and dissection. And then, there was his fascination with death. Newspapers would announce recent deaths in town. He would read the obituaries, lingering over the names of middle-aged women who had just been buried, women who reminded him of her. And then, one night, under the cold glow of the moon, Ed Gein picked up his shovel and he started to dig. By 1947, Ed's obsession with his mother had grown into something far more disturbing. She was gone, but he longed to bring her back, not just in memory, physically. So, in the dead of night, under the cold glow of the moon, Ed Gein drove to Plainfield Cemetery. Armed with a shovel, a flashlight, and an empty burlap sack, he approached the freshly dug grave of a recently deceased woman. The soil was still loose, making it easy to move. Inch by inch, he unearthed the coffin, pried it open, and reached inside. For the first time, Ed Gein touched the cold, lifeless skin of the dead. He lifted the corpse from the casket, placed it inside his sack, and took it home. There, under the cover of darkness, in the secrecy of his decaying farmhouse, he peeled away the flesh. For the next 10 years, Gein became a predator of the graveyard. He would scour newspapers, searching for women who reminded him of Augusta. Once they were buried, he would wait until the cover of night. Then, he would dig. He made at least 40 separate trips to local cemeteries, but not every trip resulted in success. Gein later admitted that sometimes he would come out of his trance, halfway through digging, and suddenly realize what he was doing. Those nights, he would fill the graves back in and walk away. But on at least 9 occasions, he followed through. He retrieved the bodies, brought them home, took them apart, used them to create things. Gein later admitted that his obsession with his mother never ended. He believed he could bring her back, that if he could rebuild her, reconstruct her, piece by piece, he could be with her again. He would slip into his woman's suit, wearing the flesh of the dead, and transform himself into Augusta. The farmhouse, once a place of strict religious discipline, had become something else entirely, a temple of the macabre, and yet, no one in town suspected a thing. For years, the odd little man who shuffled through the streets of Plainfield was dismissed as nothing more than a harmless eccentric. No one thought twice about him. No one ever imagined what he was doing. Until one day, when grave robbing was no longer enough. By the early 1950s, grave robbing had become routine for Ed Gein. The obituaries in the local newspaper were his roadmap. Each death announcement, a new opportunity. Each burial, a potential visit under the cover of night. But as the years passed, something changed. The bodies in the ground were cold, lifeless, unmoving. Ed needed more, and so he set his sights on the living. Mary Hogan was not the type of woman Augusta Gein would have approved of. She was loud, brash, independent. She cursed like a sailor, drank whiskey, and ran her own business. A tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, about 6 miles from Plainfield. She was the opposite of the quiet, submissive women Augusta had always preached about, and that made her dangerous in Ed's mind. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan's tavern was unusually empty. It was late in the afternoon, and as the sun set over the small town, no one noticed when a quiet, strange man stepped inside. What happened next is unknown, but when the next customer arrived hours later, Mary Hogan was gone. Her cash register sat open, the tavern deserted, and on the floor, a large pool of blood, still wet. Police found a single spent cartridge from a .32 caliber pistol. The blood trail led from behind the bar, out the back door, and into the parking lot, where it stopped beside tire tracks. But there was no body. For 3 years, Mary Hogan's disappearance remained a mystery. Rumors spread through town. Some said she'd left Wisconsin. Others believed she had been murdered, her body dumped somewhere in the woods. No one had answers, but Ed did. Months later, as locals joked about Mary Hogan's disappearance, Ed chuckled and muttered, "She's not missing. She's at my farm right now." They laughed. No one took him seriously, but he wasn't joking, and he wasn't done. By 1957, Ed Gein had spent over a decade alone in the farmhouse. His thoughts had grown darker, more twisted, and then, on November 16th, he made his boldest move yet. It was a cold Saturday morning. Bernice Worden, 58 years old, was opening up Worden's hardware store in downtown Plainfield. She had run the shop for years, taking it over after her husband died. The people of Plainfield knew her well, but that morning, she was uneasy. The night before, she had spoken with Ed Gein. He had come in asking about antifreeze, saying he would return the next day to purchase some. Something about him made her uncomfortable. Her son, Frank Worden, was a deputy sheriff. Before leaving for his shift that morning, he warned his mother, "That man gives me the creeps. Be careful." By midday, Bernice Worden was gone. Her store was silent. The cash register was open. A trail of blood led from the counter, out the back door. On the floor sat a sales receipt, the last transaction written by Bernice that morning. a sale for antifreeze. The customer was Ed Gein. That evening, Frank Worden returned home, but his mother wasn't there. He drove to the hardware store expecting to find her closing up for the day. Instead, he found an empty store and a crime scene. He radioed for backup immediately. Within hours, police had one suspect in mind, Ed Gein. That night, officers made their way down the empty dirt roads to the old Gein farmhouse. They found Ed inside a local grocery store, acting as though nothing had happened. He was calm, smiling, almost amused. When asked if he had seen Bernice Worden, he simply said, "Oh, she's at the farm." They arrested him on the spot. But what they didn't yet realize was that Bernice Worden was not the only horror waiting for them on that farm. As officers stepped inside the Gein home, they were immediately overwhelmed by the smell of death. The house was filthy, rotting food, piles of trash, old newspapers stacked to the ceiling. But then, their flashlights revealed something else, something unimaginable. Hanging from the ceiling of a shed was the body of Bernice Worden. She had been decapitated, gutted, and hung upside down like a slaughtered deer. Her torso had been split open, her internal organs removed. She had been shot once in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. But the mutilations, those happened after. And then, the search of the house began. What officers found inside that farmhouse defied all reason. The following items were documented: 4 noses, a collection of human skulls, 9 vulvas stored in a shoebox, a belt made from human nipples, chairs upholstered in human skin, a lampshade crafted from a human face, masks made from the peeled skin of victims, bowls made from human skulls, a corset stitched together from a woman's torso, a pair of leggings made from human leg skin, fingernails carefully collected from multiple victims, and most disturbingly, a full-body woman's suit, carefully stitched together from human flesh. He had been wearing it, dancing in it, pretending to be his mother. It was beyond murder, beyond madness. It was something else entirely. When confronted, Gein confessed immediately. He admitted to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He admitted to stealing bodies from the local graveyard. But when asked how many people he had murdered, he simply smiled and said, "Just 2." But was he telling the truth? Authorities were never able to confirm whether Gein had killed more victims. The remains found in his house, most of them came from the graves he robbed. But were there other murders? Victims who were never found? To this day, no one knows. The town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, had been rocked by horrors beyond imagination. For years, people had whispered dark rumors about the strange, reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of town. But no one had ever imagined the truth. Now, with 2 murders confirmed, countless bodies desecrated, and his farmhouse filled with gruesome trophies, Ed Gein was finally in police custody. But what would be done with him? Would he face justice? Or would he simply disappear behind the walls of an asylum, never to be seen again? On November 16, 1957, Ed Gein was formally charged with the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. But the case was far from simple. His actions were so disturbing, so beyond comprehension, that authorities questioned whether he could even be held legally responsible for his crimes. He was ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation, and the results were as expected. Ed Gein was found legally insane, unable to comprehend the severity of his crimes, unfit to stand trial. He was transferred to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he was confined indefinitely. For over a decade, he waited there, locked away, as the world outside struggled to understand the depth of his depravity. But in 1968, doctors determined that Gein was finally mentally competent to stand trial. And so, after 11 years in an asylum, the butcher of Plainfield was finally brought before a judge. The trial was short. Held without a jury, it was a bench trial, meaning the judge alone would determine his fate. The evidence was overwhelming. The crime scene photos, the remains, the gruesome artifacts found in his home. The case against him was airtight. On November 14, 1968, Judge Robert Golmar delivered the verdict: guilty, but legally insane. Instead of facing execution or life in prison, Ed Gein was returned to a mental institution, this time to Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he would remain for the rest of his life. For him, the nightmare was over, but for the world, the legend of Ed Gein was only just beginning. Ed Gein spent the rest of his days locked away, far removed from the horrors he had once committed. Unlike the monstrous image painted by the media, he was quiet, docile, even polite. He became a model patient. He read books, drew pictures, and tended the institution's garden, living out his final years in relative peace. One nurse would later recall that Gein was just an old man who spent most of his time staring out the window. The world had come to see him as a monster, a villain, a walking nightmare. But within the walls of Mendota Mental Health Institute, he was just another patient. And in 1984, his story came to an end. Ed Gein lived in silence, his name fading into urban legend. But in July of 1984, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. His health deteriorated quickly, and on July 26th, at the age of 77, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure. No family, no mourners, no tears shed. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, the very same cemetery where he had once dug up his victims. And in a final twist of irony, his gravestone was later stolen, just as he had once stolen the bodies of the dead. Though Ed Gein was gone, his legend lived on. His crimes became the inspiration for some of the most terrifying characters in horror history. Norman Bates, Psycho 1960, Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974, Buffalo Bill, The Silence of the Lambs 1991. His obsession with his mother, his skin wearing, his grave robbing, all were woven into these fictional nightmares, ensuring that his legacy would never be forgotten. But was it right to turn his crimes into entertainment? For some, movies like Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre were nothing more than horror films, works of fiction meant to thrill and terrify. But for those who remembered the truth, for the families of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, there was nothing entertaining about what had happened in Plainfield, Wisconsin, because Ed Gein wasn't just a character in a movie. He wasn't a script. He wasn't a monster in a story. He was real, and the things he did will haunt history forever. This is Dead Silence.